So the topic is logical realism. It's really about the metaphysics of logic, if you like. I was actually inspired by this topic again. I mean, I've thought about it before a little bit, but not in these terms. But I was inspired by it again about a year ago, actually talking to Sanderson. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to think about it some more. And now I'm trying to get something out of this topic. So really, I'm just going to map the use of this notion and the idea of logical realism in general. I hope that you can see roughly what's on the slides, but I will talk through everything relevant as well. So the idea of logical realism starts from some sort of combination of metaphysical realism and the thought that logical facts are mind and language independent in a yet to be specified sense. But this doesn't yet tell us anything about what the nature of logical facts is, or indeed what our epistemic access to logical facts are. These are topics that I will cover a little bit today. And like I said, the goal is just to, in the first instance, outline and systematize the use of the notion of logical realism and just try to get a little bit more specific about what this thesis about the nature of logic could mean. Now, I believe that logical realism in this yet to be specified sense is true. I think I've believed it at least since 2009 when I was writing about the law of non-contradiction. Now, this is a paper that, thanks to Gregory Gabriardi, is actually available in Portuguese as well. It's translated, so you can find it online. I think in Critica is the journal. But in this paper, I just focused on the law of non-contradiction, as I call it, as a metaphysical principle. But what I really meant is that the law of non-contradiction is not only a principle of logic, but it's something that's true in some sort of a mind and language independent sense as well. It tells us something about the mind and language independent reality. And now I'd like to sort of expand a little bit on that idea and see if we can actually get a theory of logical realism out of this. Now, back in the day, I was influenced by a paper from 2004 by Edwin Maresch. And I'm not going to talk about it in any detail here, but I have a quote from that paper. It's in the volume on the law of non-contradiction. So Maresch is interested in metaphysical dialectism, a position that he calls metaphysical dialectism, and he defines it like this. The metaphysical dialectist holds that there are aspects of the world, or of some possible world, for which any accurate description will contain a true contradiction. He contrasts it with the position he calls semantic dialectism, which maintains that it is always possible to redescribe this aspect of the world using different vocabulary, or perhaps vocabularies, consistently without sacrificing accuracy. Now, Maresch associates the position of metaphysical dialectism, which is obviously the much more radical of these two positions, with, you know it, Graham Priest. Now, perhaps there are others who believe this, but Graham Priest is the main sort of target there. Now, I don't think that the thesis of semantic dialectism is very radical at all. I think most of us probably believe it. It's just the thought that there are some aspects of language that are inconsistent or give rise to semantic contradictions. Just the fact that there are semantic paradoxes like the liar are obvious proof of this sort of view. But it's this combination of some sort of metaphysical realism and the dialectist position that gives rise to metaphysical dialectism. A couple of years later, Graham Priest, in his revised edition of the book In Contradiction, took up on this idea. You don't have to read the whole quote here. I'm just going to focus on three aspects. So Priest defines the metaphysical dialectist position by these three aspects. First, there is an extra-linguistic reality. Second, reality is constituted by facts or by fact-like entities such as objects come properties. And thirdly, there are some sort of polarities within these facts. So if there's a positive fact F plus, then there must be a corresponding one F minus that could make some proposition true. Okay. Now, this is just to show that there's some sort of an idea of metaphysical realism behind this sort of metaphysical dialectist position. And indeed, it gives us some sort of motivation to try to get clear on this idea of logical realism. And we can systematize this idea that we see both in Maresch and in Priest by looking at some more recent work. Actually, there's already a paper by Michael Resnick from '99 called Against Logical Realism, where you can see this notion in use, but he uses it in a slightly more restricted sense. Nevertheless, it's Sandra Lapointe who takes up this idea of logical realism, looking at Bolzano, in fact. But this is a paper in the volume on the metaphysics of logic. I believe Sandra cited Priest's paper in that volume as well today. So Sandra Lapointe is interested in giving this sort of simple definition of logical realism, and it constitutes of these two principles. First is called LF, for logical facts, and the second is called IND, for independent. So the first is just that there are logical facts or logical structure. This becomes important later. That is, there's some fact of the matter when it comes to the truth value claim. And the second condition is what I'm more interested in, the independence condition, and that's just what I've stated already. Logical facts are independent of our cognitive and linguistic makeup and practices. So they are objective in the sense that they are mind and language independent. Now, like Sandra Lapointe in this paper, I want to set aside today the analysis of truth, logical truth. This is certainly something that we must address when we talk about this topic at some point, but it will help us to not mix it up too much here. Now, in the same volume, I have a paper where I try to talk about logical truth a little bit in this context, but I will set it aside for now. And like I said, I will focus on the second of these conditions a little bit more. Okay, good. So that's our starting point. Now, as Sandra Lapointe herself correctly observes, these conditions are quite loose still. So they're compatible with various views, and at least Lapointe does not want to include all these views under the label of logical realism. In particular, she does not want to include something like Stuart Shapiro's folk relativism under this type of view. This is reference to Shapiro's paper in the very same volume, although you could also look at Shapiro's book from the same year if you want to read more about his views. So Shapiro defines this idea of folk relativism about logic by drawing an analogy to relativism about things like simultaneity and length, which we know to be relative. Now, an example that he mentions is something like the logical pluralism of J.C. Beale and Greg Restall. So they would be folk relativists about logical validity, if you like. Now, even if you are logical pluralist like this, it can still be objective that in a given case, or frame of reference to use Shapiro's sense, true premises entail a true contradiction. So case is a technical term that they use, Beale Restall, that is. So what this means is that this type of logical pluralism could still fulfill the independence condition, and indeed the logical facts condition that we started out with. So they would be compatible with the two principles for logical realism. But Lapointe wants to rule out logical pluralism from logical realism. So we need to get a little bit clearer about what this conditions entail. And there are a few ways to try to get clearer about this. Now, I don't want to spend an awful lot of time talking about logical pluralism. We can talk about it a little bit more if you like. Probably we'll talk about more about it in the coming 2 days. But I'll give you a brief outline by referring to a paper that you may not have yet read by Matti Eklund. This is a forthcoming paper in Inquiry. It's called Making Sense of Logical Pluralism. It's already online, so you can look it up. But Eklund is interested in just making sense of what this debate between monism and pluralism is about. And it's going to be helpful for us to look at these different ways of defining logical pluralism in order to make sense of the possible requirement regarding logical realism as well. So very, very briefly, Eklund gives these 4 attempts to define or understand the debate between pluralism and monism. These are in the context of what he calls sort of a tension between an actual language project and a normative project. And the first one makes clear what the actual language project is about. It's what he calls mapping pluralism. It's just the idea that there are different possible languages that we could speak. And that seems like something that's going to be trivially true, and hence not an interesting type of pluralism. The second type is maybe a little bit more interesting, indeterminacy pluralism. It's just the idea that it's indeterminate which of these languages is the actual language we speak. I think he mentions the possibility of the paraconsistent language or the glottal language, where there's truth value gaps or something like this. So it could be indeterminate which of those languages is true. But that as well is about something that's defined in the context of the actual language project, which Eklund doesn't think is very interesting here. The reason for this is that there's no normative element here. Now the third one is what he calls purpose pluralism, and that's the idea that different languages or different truth predicates perhaps are best for different purposes. That is perhaps a slightly more interesting thesis, but it may also be trivially true. Now, just think about something like the context of quantum mechanics. Even if you think that that classical logic is good for most purposes, in that particular context, you might think that, well, you have to employ some different kind of language, maybe even a paraconsistent language, but that doesn't yet make any sort of normative claim. So to get in the normative claim about the nature of logic, as it were, we go to goodness pluralism, the fourth option here. So that's the idea that given some particular purpose, different languages serve that purpose equally well. So that's an interesting thesis. There could be some sort of privileged normative idea here for the logical monist. And that's probably going to get closer to what Lapointe as well might have in mind. So interesting, but what is this privileged purpose? That's the key question. And Eklund spends some time talking about this. Okay, now I'll set this aside, but actually the picture is even more complicated because Eklund defines two different varieties of each of these approaches based on what he calls canopian pluralism and a Beal-Restall pluralism. But we don't need to go into that. It's not going to make any difference for my purposes now. So, goodness pluralism. What is this normative content? What is the ought? How we ought to reason, for instance? Well, if that ought is interpreted just as, in terms of logic, that we ought to reason logically, it's not going to tell us very much about the nature of logic. If we want to get into the bottom of what logic is about, and someone just tells you that it means that you ought to reason logically, it's not going to give us the context that we want here. Another option is epistemically, that we ought to reason in such a way that we get to our epistemic goals in a most effective possible way. More promising perhaps, but it suffers from the possibility, for instance, of what Eklund calls quick and dirty rules. So in some cases, it might be epistemically more beneficial for you to reason in terms of these quick and dirty rules that do not necessarily follow logical principles that you're familiar with. So the logical ought in that case couldn't be strictly epistemic in this sort of sense. But here's another option, truth preservation. We ought to reason in such a way that we preserve truth. Seems more promising, perhaps, but it's probably too general. So in this canopian context, for instance, we might still say that different logics will preserve truth for different languages, and that could be perfectly objective. But Eklund as well, at least here, is concerned about some points from Harley Field, and I think rightly so. As you may know, Field thinks that validity cannot be understood as truth preservation at all. Field's conclusion here is that we end up with some sort of anti-realism about epistemic normativity. He has this expressivist project that you may be familiar with. So if that's right, then we would end up with the result that there's no correct logic in this privileged sense, in some sort of goal-independent sense. Okay, so there are problems with each of these approaches in getting to the bottom of the debate between pluralism and monism. And I should say that Eklund himself is kind of skeptical about making good sense of this. Moreover, he thinks that the logical monist will have some trouble here because the logical monist, if they commit to this idea that there's a single epistemically normative property that's somehow possessed by unique logic, that's going to be much too an extreme view here. And I think that a logical realist should not be committed to this type of view. We don't want logical realism to entail such a strong commitment to logical monism. Or if this is what Lapointe has in mind, then I think that logical realism will be a difficult position to maintain. So I want to find a different way of understanding this requirement. Now, Eklund himself suggests that a more reasonable logical monist opponent, refers to opponent to field here, would focus on whether there is a unique best logic for a given goal. But as you'll notice, this just takes us back to a type of logical pluralism as well. And it's unlikely to be compatible with Lapointe's requirement. So for a given goal, there could be a unique best logic. Okay. So maybe this is even compatible with something like Shapiro's fault relativism. Now, very quick outline here, but there's one more possible way of understanding the debate between logical monism and logical pluralism that Eklund mentions, and which just sidesteps because he's not interested in that. But it turns out to be particularly useful for my purposes today. That's the idea of, as Eklund puts it, logic of the book of the world. Now, this just refers to Ted Sider's book, Writing the Book of the World. And Ted Sider turns out to be, it seems, a type of logical realist, if you like. So here's what Eklund says about Sider. Sider's view being that among the possible meanings for logical concepts, for instance, there are some that are especially fundamental, or natural, or structural, or joint carving, or enter your favorite sort of fundamental notion here, I suppose. Now, for Sider, it's important that it's the existential quantifier that is privileged in this relevant sense. So it's the existential quantifier that carves at the joints. And, well, he even puts forward a type of an indispensability argument for this sort of result. We don't have to go into the details of that, but the idea is clear enough, and it is that the one true logic, according to this idea, would then attempt to capture those logical expressions that have this privileged sense of joint carvingness. Okay. And this, I think, will satisfy the type of requirement that Lapointe is after, this type of logical monism, this joint carving idea. Now, the point of interest is that for Sider himself, the fundamental language, which is this joint carving language, will contain some logical expressions. Like I mentioned, the existential quantifier is particularly important here. But there will be no metalogical expressions in this language for Sider. And this helps him with some aspects. He can rule out problems concerning semantic paradoxes and vagueness, for instance. Now, this is actually precisely the reason why Eklund thinks that this might not be so interesting a way to pitch the monist-pluralist debate, because I can't remember his exact words, but the idea is that this takes us to metaphysics rather than, philosophy of logic. But I think today it's okay because we're doing the metaphysics of logic, right? Okay. Now, we can find something quite similar in Penelope Maddy's work. Her book, The Second Philosophy. And I think I have a quote here on the next page. Yeah. So this is like a starting point that Maddy gives us. And she develops on this. She defines these three conditions. Logic is true of the world because of its underlying structural features. Secondly, human beings believe logical truths because their most primitive cognitive mechanisms allow them to detect and represent the aforementioned features of the world. And thirdly, human beings are so configured cognitively because they live in a world that is so structured physically. Okay, so this is an idealized starting point and sort of core of Maddy's naturalistic project. So she wants to find some sort of structure, logical structure in the world, and she further wants to say that our cognitive makeup is somehow reflecting that structure. It's a very strong thesis, but an interesting one. And it seems clear that it reflects some type of commitment to logical realism in the terms that we've started to develop here. And I want to say a little bit more about Maddy's approach because it's an interesting example of this type of view. But notice first the epistemic commitment here. We see that actually already in Resnick's paper that I mentioned from '99 against logical realism. So Resnick says that or he speculates about our epistemic access to logical facts in terms of logical realism. And he says that one might hold that although a truth being logically true is independent of us, our recognizing something as logically true derives from our internalizing or knowing or reflecting upon our inferential practice or our linguistic conventions or our powers of imagination or what have you. So we might think that there's some mind-independent, realm of mind-independent logical facts, but the fact that we recognize them could still be somehow deriving from our internal cognitive makeup or linguistic makeup. Some sort of a connection between the two could, of course, be speculated about. Now, Resnick himself draws a close analogy between logical and mathematical realism here, but I think that's going to be a too strict a way to interpret logical realism the way I'm intending it here. For instance, it may not cover Sider's view at all. Sider is presumably not a mathematical realist in this sort of relevant sense, or at least wouldn't have to be. Okay, so I think that logical realism, I want to be neutral about it just to begin with, should be compatible with a range of views about both the nature of the logical fact and our epistemic access to those logical facts. And indeed, you better be neutral about the epistemic access if you are neutral about the nature of the logical facts. Because if you don't have any commitments about whether the logical facts are abstract in some sort of Platonic heaven or a Phrygian third realm, or whether they are somehow reflected in the empirical world, well, then you don't yet know what the best epistemic access of these logical facts is, presumably not anyway. Okay, and the view that I had before is that the logical structure does somehow correspond with the concrete structure of reality rather than some sort of abstract Platonic realm. That's also another reason why I don't want to associate it too closely with mathematical realism of the usual sort. Okay, back to Maddie. Now, her naturalistic project is a very good example of this type of empirically motivated logical realism, if you like. Although I don't think that she mentions or uses the notion of logical realism in the book at all. It's a long book, 400 pages. I haven't read it cover to cover, but so inform me if you happen to know that she uses the notion. But I think it's pretty clear that she has something similar in mind. She draws inspiration from historical sources, Frege and Kant in particular, and traces the normativity of logic in the relevant sense here to Frege's idea, actually, that logic is concerned with the laws of truth rather than mere laws of thought. What does that mean? Well, it just means this. The laws of logic are removed from the laws of physics only by a matter of degree. Their subject matter is, in a sense, the same, but the laws of logic are somehow the most general types of laws that concern reality. So it would be misleading to say that they are laws of thought, except perhaps in the sense that they are the most general laws or principles that we must follow if we want to say something about reality. But recall that Frege, of course, had in mind something a little bit different from Maddie's naturalistic project. There was this third realm that Frege was committed to. Maddie is not committed to this at all. However, like we saw already in the idealistic starting point, Maddie herself does go beyond here, beyond the simple statement of what logical realism is about, and wants to say something about our epistemic access to logical facts as well. And moreover, she wants to give this empirically motivated, naturalistic account of our access to the logical facts. Now, she defines a notion called the KF world for a Kant-Frege world, which is this idealized starting point. But the problem here is that it's very difficult to get evidence, empirical evidence, that there's some sort of logical structure reflected in the world beyond perhaps some very rudimentary type of logic. So the key problem for her project is moving from this rudimentary logic that maybe concerns things like identity, perhaps some other very simple logical principles, to something like classical logic. This is presumably what we want to get to. Or indeed paraconsistent logic if you think that's the right way to go here. So I'm not going to spend any time pursuing this project here, but this is, I think, an interesting attempt, very ambitious attempt to defend a certain type of logical realism. And Maddie spends a lot of time with this. She looks at empirical evidence from infant cognition, for instance. And I think that she makes a pretty decent case that there's something like the rudimentary logic reflected say, infant cognition. Okay. Now, but like I said, I want to be neutral about the epistemic element here. I think that it should not be part of the definition of logical realism. It's an additional point that someone who defends logical realism must address eventually, but it shouldn't be built into the definition. Okay. Good. So we've seen a few examples here of views that could be called logical realism. Another recent attempt, which reflects Ted Sider's work again here, is by Mikkel and McSweeney. Now, this is a paper which is just a manuscript, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but I hope that it sees the light of day soon. But since she gives a very good starting point for a definition of logical realism, I want to say a few words about it. She doesn't defend logical realism, but she starts from the idea that, well, if logical realism is true, then which of our logical concepts or terms respect the logical structure? What does that mean, this respecting of the logical structure? Well, it seems to me that she has in mind something like Maddie's idea, that there must be some sort of a causal link between the logical concepts or terms that we use and the worldly logical structure, however that is understood. But she is not optimistic about this project. She thinks that there's a dilemma that we will face here. She calls privileged versus unfamiliar. The idea is just that someone who is committed to the privileged version holds that in every case there will be a privileged interpretation or a privileged type of logical quantifier or logical notion. I mentioned the existential and the universal quantifier as an example here, because this is obviously something that someone like Ted Sider would face, a question that Ted Sider would face. So recall, Sider says the existential quantifier carves at the joints, so it respects the logical structure of the world. But as we all know, we can define the existential quantifier with negation and the universal quantifier. And the same will be true of any true functionally complete set of the logical constants. So we can ask this question in a multiple of different ways. But think about the distinction between the existential and the universal quantifier. What sort of reasons do we have to prefer one or the other? If we want to say that one of them must respect the logical structure of the world, well, which one? McSweeney thinks that the unfamiliar position is where we will end up if we ask this question seriously, because she doesn't think that we have any good reason to think that either one of them necessarily respects the logical structure of the world. So this is just going to be an agnostic position. We don't know what the true logical structure is, and we better not be too optimistic that we can ever know that. Okay, that's unfamiliar. Okay, so I'm a little bit more optimistic than McSweeney is about this, but this is obviously a key problem for the logical realists, like Ted Sider in these terms. Now, she ends up with two versions of logical realism, and this is, I think, closest to what we get of a systematic account so far. She calls them ontological realism and ideological realism. Now, I don't much like these terms because these are terms that are used elsewhere in metaphysics for very different kinds of use. So I will actually propose a slightly different terminology, but let's just start with these. So the ontological realist position would then be the view that logical constants refer to individual entities. And that's going to be a very fine-grained theory, as you can see. It means that only one, either the existential or universal quantifier, can carve at the joints. But as we just asked, it's very difficult to see that we have any good criteria for determining which one of them would carve at the joints. So perhaps you'll agree with me that on the face of it, the second option looks much more attractive. That's the ideological realist position. And that's the view that logical constants are syncatagrammatic. They do not refer. They do not refer to any individual entities, but they are more or less joint carving bits of ideology. So they're part of the fundamental language. And this McSweeney associates with Sider's view. Okay, good. Now, one thing that is of some interest here, perhaps, is that there's maybe a novel sense of logical pluralism that you might extract from this situation. And that is the question of redundancy at the fundamental level. So I've been saying that you have to make a decision between the existential and the universal quantifier. Which one of them carves at the joints, right? Well, why not say both? Why not accept some sort of redundancy at the fundamental level? This type of redundancy or non-redundancy or uniqueness requirement about the fundamental seems to be where the decision point is. I'm not totally made up I haven't totally made up my mind about this, but it seems to me that it might be possible to motivate abandoning the uniqueness requirement and hence endorsing a type of logical pluralism. Now, I must stress this is a type of logical pluralism that is far removed from something like real-restal pluralism, but it seems a pluralist position nevertheless. Now, why do I think that there might be some chance of abandoning this requirement? Well, I have a sort of an analogy for you from colors. Now, I don't think colors are fundamental, so this is just for illustration. But I think it's an interesting fact that not only in terms of colors, but in other areas of human inquiry as well, we have equivalent ways of defining things. So take the familiar color space, red, green, blue. We can give any color a coding or mapping in terms of the RGB framework, but we can also give the same color a mapping in terms of the luminance-chrominance network. Now, why do we have these two mappings? Well, one reason is that the luminance-chrominance framework gives a better sense of human color perception. If we turn off the lights here, everything looks black to us. But that's a feature of the luminance of the room, right? So we might want to take that into account. But in each case, we can have a translation between these frameworks. So in one sense, they're redundant. It just depends on the context that we use, which one we might prefer. And in the same sense, why not think that we could have both of the quantifiers, the existential and the universal quantifier, at the fundamental level in some sense? I don't know. Maybe there are some theoretical costs here regarding our ontological commitments, but it doesn't seem to me that this is as clear-cut a case as some other cases of adopting simplicity or parsimony. So does something like Occam's razor consideration apply here? I'm not certain. I'm open to discussion. Okay, that's a bit of a side note, really. I want to give you another case where it might matter what your views of biological realism are. And this is from the currently very popular grounding literature. Okay, you don't have to know much about the grounding literature to get this example. This is a simple enough case. I'll tell you everything you need to know. So there's a discussion about so-called plural grounds versus conjunctive grounds in the conjunctive in the grounding literature. And the distinction is just this. You might think that a fact F is grounded in these two facts, G and H. There's G comma H here, right? So there's G and H. And F is grounded in those two facts. Each of them is a partial ground for the fact F, okay? But you might also think that F or another fact is grounded in the conjunction G and H. So you need G and H, the conjunction of the G and H, to give the full grounds for F. Okay, fair enough. These are two cases. Now, it's also commonly accepted in the grounding literature that whenever you have a true conjunction, like G and H here, well, the conjunction will be grounded in its conjuncts. So the conjunction of G and H, G and H, is grounded in G comma H. Okay, seems okay. If something's both wooden and metallic, then we need the conjunction of the wooden and metal to ground it. Okay. Now, is there a distinction between the plural ground and the conjunctive ground? So is there a distinction between G comma H and G and H, the conjunction? Well, on a so-called worldly conception of facts, which, for instance, Paul Oerde in the grounding literature has defended, it's not obvious that there is. And that's just the idea that whenever you have a conjunction of two things, G and H, well, when you look at the world, when you look at what the fact represents in the world, what its, as it were, non-factual constituents are, well, you're just going to find G and H there. You're not going to find the conjunction. Well, that's how you might think in any case. But if you think that way, then you're in trouble, because grounding is supposed to be irreflexive. This is commonly accepted in the literature. And if grounding is irreflexive, G and H and G comma H must be distinguished, because you do not want the conjunction G and H to ground itself. Now, this is really something that reflects the explanatory part of the idea about grounding. So something like a commitment to the principle of sufficient reason. You want there to be a sufficient explanation for the conjunction. So the conjunction cannot explain itself. This is the general idea in the literature. All right. So now we have a bit of a dilemma here. But it turns out that if you adopt this fine-grained view about logical realism, whereby the logical constants refer to entities, well, then you can say that the conjunction with the G and H, well, it's also part of the worldly structure, even on the worldly conception of facts, which I happen to favor, by the way. So if you adopt the fine-grained view of logical realism, you have a type of solution of the dilemma that a worldly conception of facts and certain views about grounding might generate. Maybe you don't think that this is a very important point, but if you happen to be working in this ground theoretic framework, you have to solve this sort of problem somehow. Okay, so that's just one further way to motivate that your views about logical realism might matter in some cases. And surprisingly, it might push us towards this more radical view about logical realism in this case that I just discussed. Here's yet another case. This is based on Kit Fine's comments on Ted Sider again. So this is a book symposium in philosophy and phenomenological research, and Kit Fine's paper in that book symposium, commenting on Sider, brief paper. Now, Fine makes a distinction between what he calls an E project and a D project. Now, E stands for expressive and D for descriptive. A little bit misleading terms, because descriptive here is supposed to be at the level of the worldly structure, not something that we say, whereas expressive is something that we say. So here's just how he defines it. The E project is concerned with saying what can be said in the most fundamental terms, while the D project is concerned with describing what can be described in the most fundamental terms. So describing is something that's language independent, as it were. It's something that's really in the worldly structure, whereas saying, expressing, is something that's at the level of language. Right. Now, look at disjunction this time. We take a disjunction, G or H. Well, on one view, you might think that while the disjunction may be dispensable at the level of the worldly structure, so if you look at the disjunction, D or H, you'll ever only find D or H in the world, or G or H, sorry. But you might still think that you cannot live without the disjunction at the level of the expressive project. So in order to express your commitments about the world or your views about the world, you might have to use disjunction. Now, similarly, you might think that you might have to use the existential quantifier. In science or mathematics, you might not be able to get by without it. But the question is, the core question here is, are there any logical constants among the D fundamentals, among the true worldly structure, and not just at the level of language? So for this sort of view to go through, a simple indispensability argument will not get you anywhere. You might be able to show that the disjunction or the existential quantifier is indispensable in your fundamental language, in your fundamental E project, but it could still be dispensable in the D project. Okay. Now, Fine has a devastating conclusion in this paper, Criticism of Sider. He says, Sider seems to take for granted that logical constants are fundamental without giving any thought to whether they are necessary for describing the world. Now, this is, pretty harsh criticism of Sider, but if you read his work, it's true that it's difficult to tell which project he has in mind. He puts forward some sort of indispensability argument for the existential quantifier. He talks about its use in science and in philosophy, but he doesn't clearly state whether he thinks that it's really part of the wordly structure in this sort of totally minor language independent sense that we were interested in. So there's a tension here. And we can maybe dissolve this tension by being more precise about what logical realism is and what sort of view about logical realism one is committed to. So here are my revised labels for the two different kinds of logical realism here, which I think are more descriptive. So the first is realism about logical constants. According to this view, G and H, the conjunction, is properly parsed only if the conjunction, in addition to the G and H, are really in the minor language independent. So this is a view according to which some constants are D-fundamental. Radical view, fine-grained view, but we saw that there might be some pressure to accept it if you have this worldly conception of facts, at least. The second view, realism biological structure, that we first found a little bit more appealing, perhaps, or I did anyway. So in that case, G and H can be parsed in terms of G, comma H, but there's going to be some logical structure in the mind and language independent reality. So logical structure is D-fundamental, but logical constants may not be. Okay. And like I said, it's not clear which one of these is Sider's view. This is at least one reason to think that we might want to be a bit more precise about the thesis of logical realism. Now, but it might seem that we don't have very clear reasons yet to go one way or another here. So I want to finish by asking, are there any further reasons to prefer one view over the other out of these things? We've seen some things pulling to different directions. And I think that considering the case of negation might be illustrative here. Negation is obviously important, and I think that realism about logical constants might, at least initially, have the upper hand in this case as well. Now, why is that? Well, that's because it's kind of difficult to see what could possibly reflect negation in the wordly structure. It's easy to see that we need negation, so it appears dispensable in the level of the expressive project. But if it's not a D-fundamental, if negation itself is not part of the logical structure of the world as an entity, as it were, well, what could possibly reflect the negative propositions in this sort of sense? Well, there's a few lines of argument that you could try here, and I mean, there's a historical precedent here. We can go back 100 years to a paper by Demis in Mind, where Demis proposes that there's always going to be some sort of positive aspect of reality that is responsible for negative propositions. So he gives very simple examples. If we have a negative proposition such as John is not at home, it's made true, by the fact that John is at the pub, of course. We always find John at the pub. So we can find something positive in the world that makes true this negative proposition. We have something worldly that makes the negative proposition true. Good. Okay. But it won't work so nicely in other cases. And you may know that Russell was very critical of this idea. And the notorious example is there is no hippopotamus in this room. Or there's no elephant in this room. Just pick your favorite large mammal. Now, how can we find positive elements that make this negative proposition true? Well, we can list that there's this table here, there are these chairs here, there's all these people here, and well, all these air molecules here, all the things that there are in this room. Together, they are the positive basis for this negative proposition about them not being any hippopotamus in this room. Now, you can develop this, and some people have attempted to make a bit more sense about this, but clearly the sort of initial intuitive pull is lost if we have to list all these positive things to get to just one negative proposition. And the problem generalizes, obviously. Now, this is a question that I find interesting in its own right, but I'm not going to spend more time with it here. But you'll find stuff by J.C. Peel, classic paper by Molnar from 2000, and Graham Priest as well, trying to figure out this idea of negative truth makers for negative truths. So this is a related discussion. I think that there's one way to make more sense about this idea, which is maybe a bit more promising than some of the attempts. And that is to appeal to some sort of primitive incompatibility as a positive feature in reality. So primitive incompatibility as a defundamental, to use that term again here. Now, I think that this thought could perhaps be traced back to Aristotle. I like to always try to trace things back to Aristotle if I can. So here's just my favorite formulation of the law of non-contradiction. The same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. Now, of course, negation is used in this formulation. But I think that the idea is really about primitive incompatibility. Because what he's saying here is that you have some subject, one subject, and that subject cannot both have this property and not have this property. So it's incompatible that it would both have this property and not have this property. Now, we say it in terms of negation, but that may just be because negation is indispensable in the sense of the E project we call. That doesn't mean that negation is defundamental. Maybe primitive incompatibility is. And this is really the idea that I'm trying to trace here. Okay, now you see some hints about this type of idea elsewhere too. I have a quote here, totally out of context, from Hugh Price's nice paper in Mind from 1990 called Why Not? So Price is actually interested in the evolutionary basis of negation, a very interesting topic in its own right. But we find there a quote like this: I suggest that negation be explained in terms of the primitive notion of incompatibility. Now, he does not have, I must emphasize, he does not have this idea that I'm talking about here in mind. But nevertheless, he gives this type of evolutionary basis to the idea that negation could be traced with some sort of incompatibility, just empirically. The metaphysical thesis here is on top of that. But Franz Boerter, much more recently, in a paper also in Mind called the modality called negation, he does hold this type of view, it seems to me. So I've got a quote from him as well. He says, what kinds of things can be compatible or incompatible? That is, can stand in incompatibility relations. Different items possibly qualify. Concepts, properties, states of affairs, events, propositions. This is good. It makes incompatibility a stable notion across different ontological categories, providing evidence for its being one that carves nature at its joints. Here we are back again at joint carving. Okay. Now, I'm not going to defend this idea any further, but I think that it gives us some sort of a starting point for someone who would want to defend the idea that primitive incompatibility is part of the worldly structure. And I do like this idea. So maybe that's something that pulls to that direction. Now, I finish with, I think, a devastating problem for the view that realism about logical structure is true. This concerns the realism about logical structure. So, the question is, what counts as logical structure? Now, we've been operating with a sort of a metaphysical realist framework here. And obviously, we want to say that in this metaphysical realist framework, there are certain terms that are fundamental or joint carving. Now, we're adding some terms from logic to this framework, perhaps. So maybe primitive incompatibility and I don't know, what else? Identity, law of non-contradiction, perhaps. But we don't want all structure to be logical structure, right? That would just mean that the thesis of logical realism is indistinguishable from the thesis of metaphysical realism. So we better have some way to distinguish between these two things, or otherwise the sort of meaning of the label seems to disappear. And I should refer to Greg Restall here, actually, because I gave a very early version of this talk in Melbourne, and he pointed out this problem. And I think this is a very difficult problem. I'm not sure what to say about it. I do want to say that the friend of realism about logical structure can't accept something like Michaela McSweeney's unfamiliar, the idea that there's just no way that we can know what the true logical structure of the world is. In that case, we certainly have no way to distinguish between metaphysical realism and a certain type of agnosticism about that metaphysical structure from logical realism. Okay, now maybe there's a way to try to go here. So you might try to say that there's some sort of defundamental logical structure that we can capture with these logical constants, something like primitive incompatibility, but these constants do not refer to entities. And maybe you can try to find empirical basis for
something like the rudimentary logic to start with and build up to classical logic like Maddie attempts to do. But this is going to be sort of contextually defined way to capture logical realism. So really, the core of the problem is finding some sort of logical modality in the world, if you hold this type of view. So whether we can find that sort of a role is up to debate. And I don't really know what to do about this problem yet. So this is something to think about. Okay. I'll conclude very briefly by summarizing what I've suggested. We started with these two criteria for logical realism. There are logical facts or logical structure, and these logical facts or logical structure is mind and language independent. Then we got, after some stages, to these two senses of logical realism more accurately defined. Realism of logical constants, so the constants refer to entities, but problem was which constants cover the joints. We don't seem to have good reasons to prefer one view or another. And the other view is realism about logical structure, and the key problem there is overgeneration. And we had kind of different considerations pulling to different directions here. I think that we should be neutral about our epistemic access to logical facts when we start talking about logical realism, and we should be neutral about the nature of logical facts as well. But obviously, these are questions that you want to address if you want to defend the view seriously. I think that logical realism is probably compatible with some senses of logical realism, in particular, logical pluralism defined in terms of this abandoning the non-redundancy or the uniqueness requirement that I mentioned. So this is a very distinctive sense of logical pluralism. But I think that it could be, or it's an open question whether logical realism is compatible with this. Okay. Lots of work remains to be done, but I'm excited to hear what you think about it. Thanks.